Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. What a pleasure to see you. I think this is the first time we're meeting since we recorded the omission of Hanukkah, and we are here to continue discussing the manuscripts of Rishonim. We were up to the Chida, I believe, and you'll give a recap. He was a primary figure in triggering this publication of manuscripts and how they came available to the Torah audience. But before we begin that, I have to mention again that all these episodes have been sponsored by an anonymous donor in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Yitzchak David. We thank him for that. And a couple of important announcements. Mesechus Nedarim is coming to an end. We have two important episodes we would like to record. One is an episode about the origins of Ataras Nedarim and Kol Nidre, relevant to Nedarim. Another one is a episode about Mesechus Nazir, the seforim available for Mesechus Nazir. I want to again ask anybody, please, who would like to be involved in sponsoring and dedicating these shows, these episodes, these podcasts, please be in touch with me. The previous episode, the Hanukkah omission, and the Nedarim episode, each of them got close to 10,000 views. So this is a great opportunity to support the work we do, Rabbi Brut, and the All Torah platform, and we appreciate that greatly. So, Rabbi Brut, I'm sure you want to begin with a recap of where we are and where we're heading. Just one small teaser. I was told that for those who are familiar with the Birchas Kohanim at the Kotel and Malamed, Rabbi Brut is going to give us an exclusive insight into the origins of that minig based on what we're going to discuss today. Rabbi Brut, how are you today?
Okay, Baruch Hashem. Very good. Okay, so basically in the 4 episodes of season 2 of Reb Chaim, we've been discussing how Rishonim come to light, the people started publishing them and using them, and we've showed that many Gedolim were involved with the publishing and of the using of them from when they started. We started trying to give some type of timeline from the early 1700s. It starts trickling in and gets stronger in the 1780s. By the 1780s, it gets a little stronger. Once you hit the 1800s, much stronger. And big Gedolim are using it, doing it, all involved with it, embracing it, so to speak. Till we get to the Mishnah Berurah and then to our Reb Chaim Kanievsky, who fully embraces it. That's what we discussed, and we ended off discussing we're trying to figure out how this happens. It's not just that it gets published, how they're aware of manuscripts. So I suggested at the end was a Yid Chida, famous, dies in 1806, who traveled all over Europe. We discussed a little bit about his travels. He saw in all different collections, private libraries, manuscripts, took notes, saw everything, wrote about it, was a massive expert in seforim, not only a tremendous Talmid Chacham. And through this, people started hearing more about it. He gives haskamas, people he was involved with are involved with this, and we discussed it a little bit. Obviously, there's much more to discuss, but we just we gave sort of a smorgasbord, a quick thing about it, and that's what we're going to do today. Also, continuing with this to get to the closer to the conclusion of what the purpose of all this is in the long run, and how it relates even more with Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So, just to mention briefly, is that if you look back, there's the Chida wrote this book we mentioned already a bunch of times. It's called Shem Gedolim, where he talks about Gedolim, about seforim, manuscripts that he's seen. So there was an earlier work, what's called the first bibliographical collection of the Jewish seforim out there was called Sifsei Yeshanim from a Yid Reb Shabsi Bas. It's published in 1680. Now Reb Shabsi Bas is world famous because he's the author of the Sifsei Chachamim on Rashi. So he was into the business of selling seforim. He put out a book which listed all the seforim available at the time by 1680, and including even some manuscripts. Some he saw, some he didn't see, he heard about. Anyway, when you look through it carefully, you'll see something which also relates to our whole story, is that seforim on Shas of Rishonim and on Rishonim Halacha is very, very little. There's a lot of seforim relatively, but on this is very little, and that's what part of our story that we've been telling in the first 4 episodes is how this happens. It takes time, and it's still happening even in our generation today. Weekly, different discoveries are happening. Okay, now, Lamashal, not only the Chida, other Gedolim of his time, I just recently came across, there's a Yid Rabbi Yehuda Najjar, which we will get to talking about him in a different episode relating to Reb Chaim Kanievsky, a contemporary of the Chida. corresponded with him, and he wrote a lot of interesting seforim. He also had manuscripts of seforim, so it was around, and that's what I also mentioned in a previous episode. It was around, it was floating around, and okay. Now the question is, how does it start getting out there to the public, so to speak? So it used to be that there was something before the internet and before all different methods of how seforim get out there, which is an interesting way of how things get out there.
You mean there was something before the seforim blog?
Yep, there was. It's interesting. How do people find out about seforim? So basically like this. There was something called, so seforim, there was journals started coming out, newspapers would come out, and they would have advertisements. Now, in different journals, people would publish, I found the work in a different place, and here's a few pages, and maybe you want to fund the rest, and sometimes they would get funding, sometimes they would end up publishing the whole sefer. This is all starting as the concept of journals and newspapers became more and more. Fast forward to 1856, one of the early newspapers, the Hamagid, had, if you go through it, and many of these issues are available online, you could see advertisements for seforim, book reviews, and excerpts from seforim that are about to come out. And the Gedolim and everyone who was reading the newspapers would hear about seforim. And until today, even you could see, anyone opens up their weekly Mishpacha or Ami magazine, you'll see advertisements. ArtScroll has a beautiful advertisement usually of what they're about to put out, and some of the other companies do, especially in certain weeks of the year, they plaster it, but that's the way people find out about things, advertising. Now, I would like to talk about one such advertisement.
I'm sure you probably could do an episode on newspapers and probably bring all the proofs that Gedolim read certain newspapers, right? I'm sure you probably could talk about that a lot, right?
Unbelievable. I didn't even tell you what I'm about to speak about in a second. You'll hear what I'm about to say. Very funny. It's very funny that you mentioned such a thing. This was not planned at all, so I'm impressed. Okay, I promise this was not planned. Okay, well, I'm about to tell a very short story. It's about 2-3 minutes, but it's very cute. I personally have a lot of enough from this story. Okay, the story goes like this. We're talking about advertisements. So basically, in January 7th of 1869, an issue of the Halavana newspaper comes out. And in there's an announcement about a new sefer that was recently published from manuscript for the first time. What was the sefer? The Ritva Masechtas Nida, and the Ritva's work, Sefer Zikaron, which is his defense for the Ramban's attacks on the Rambam in Chumash. So the Ritva defends the Rambam, which is its own interesting Nukuda, but not for now. Now, the Sefer Zikaron comes out, and someone, Zalman Stern, writes a comment with this chibur dealing with the famous Rambam about Karbonis and the Ramban about it, and he says some ha'ara, and it says, so this is the first page in the particular newspaper. Okay, here is a picture. It got cut off the part, but this is the newspaper. Here's the advertisement, and then here's the whole ha'ara. Okay, anyway, less than a month later, in the February 11th issue of this newspaper, the Netziv writes a lengthy response to Stern's comment. It's a beautiful essay of the Netziv related to the Karbonis. Okay, and the Netziv, this piece of Torah of the Netziv is published a few years back in a new version of the Meshav Davar that came out, which has a whole bunch of new stuff of the Netziv. Fine. Now I notice when I'm looking at this tshuva, there's a ... in the beginning, and it doesn't tell you exactly where this tshuva is coming, where this piece of Torah is coming from. I get very, very curious. I start looking, and I discover that it's from the newspaper Halavana. Now it's well known. I have documented this a lot. The Netziv submitted many articles and ha'aras and things in newspapers, and he read many newspapers. Now, in recent years, there's been a controversy going back. What about reading newspapers on Shabbos? And what did the Netziv do about reading newspapers on Shabbos? Interestingly enough, it's been claimed that the Netziv did not read newspapers on Shabbos, although some said that he did. They're not reliable. Anyway, when one goes back to this issue in the newspaper, Halavana, where he writes this comment about the newspaper, about the Sefer Zikaron and Karbonis, he says as follows. It came from Vilna, Shabbos HaKodesh, Shnei Ali Levanon, from this and this year, the Karasi LeShabbos Einig. I read your thing about what you said about the Sefer Zikaron and Ritva. Here we have black and white, and it's saying, we call Am Ve'edu, that he read the newspaper on Shabbos. Anyway, I don't really think that there's more better proof than this. I found this myself, but then I later on discovered that Professor Lyman had already made this discovery himself a few years back. Anyway, bottom line is, this is how they would know about things, through newspaper articles. That's how they would hear about things.
Obviously, Rabbi Dr. Brud is not using his rabbinic title to paskin about reading newspapers and what the Netziv read. It's just fascinating to know that he picked up a newspaper, which obviously had all kinds of things in it, and read it on Shabbos.
Correct. But as I have documented a lot about this, and some of these articles already are available in the Netziv's, a whole series about this, especially also relating with newspapers. The Netziv has a particular tshuva where he specifically is makel about reading newspapers. Now, the question will obviously be, what is the newspapers that he's referring to? What are the newspapers that are, doesn't mean everything in the newspapers? He could be reading the Torah apart. This piece is a piece of Torah. So it's published in the newspaper, okay, big deal. So how far could you go into? But there's obviously the sugya of shtari hadiyaitis, and everything relating to this is its own very, very big sugya. A lot has been written about it, and a lot has been discussed, but sadly a lot has been censored about the Netziv Shita about it, where he has written halachic tshuva about this. But okay, we're not going to go into this right now. Anyway, this is a tangent, but the point of this tangent was to show that newspaper articles was where people would print pieces, and also how people would hear about it. But now what gets more important out, the next step of the story is, where did this manuscript come from? So it came from a private collection of a Yid who's known as Shin Zayin. Ches Hey was his Rosh Tevis, and that's how you always will find him quoted in various literature. Now the question is, who is this person with these initials? Yeah.
Where would somebody who doesn't frequent the same books and articles that you do may have seen these initials?
So I'm going to say shortly. That's why in 1 second we're going to see exactly what it is. So first, the initials are to his name is Shlomo Zalman Halberstam. Okay. Who is he? He's born in 1832 and he dies in 1900. Seems to have been a very wealthy businessman, very learned, and one of the things is he collected seforim. He was a mashinidik, a seforim collector. Now, there are other people that are seforim collectors, but he seems to have known his collection very well, his manuscripts. And one of the interesting things about him is that he was very nice to people. He would lend out manuscripts even. People they heard that he had a manuscript, and now these manuscripts, they went for a lot of money even in those days. And he would lend them to publish and everything like that. Just as an example, Chafetz Chaim's son, who we've quoted numerous times in his book about his father, he talks about, why aren't there Rishonim on Kachim? Whatever happened to them? So he says he wrote a letter to who? To Shlomo Zalman Halberstam, and he gave him an answer. Okay, so now this Shlomo Zalman had connections with everyone, and the reason is people wanted to make use of his library. They would ask him questions based on what he had in his library, and he would share with them. But he didn't only just have a library. He published manuscripts in his library himself, and sometimes he helped people who published it. And such an example is the Ritva Nida and the Sefer Zikaron. Numerous other works, and someone would see them, would be from seforim that he published. Just to mention, he published the work of the Ibn Ezra from manuscript, Rishonim on Yeshayahu, an incredible work called Sefer Yetzirah from Rabbi Yehuda Barcelona. Now, it's not a Kabbalistic sefer. It's a completely different type of sefer, but it's a mashunidik, interesting sefer from a Rishon, early Rishon. Massive, few hundred pages. He published it with a whole history about it. And later on, which we'll get back to this, Rabbi Yaakov Shor, one of the Gedolei Galitzia, writes unbelievable how incredible that he published the sefer, how the chashivas of the sefer, and there's a lot of fascinating things about it. It's worthy of its own episode at least. So we're not going to do that now, but he publishes that, and he publishes others, and he publishes articles, dozens of articles. Now, I said he was a seforim collector. It seems he was a crazy seforim collector even at a young age. Who the first person who wrote about him as an article was B'chayav, was Moshe Reines, in a sefer called in a sefer that he wrote about various people called Dar V'Chachamav, which I was able to republish it a few years ago when I collected many of the writings of Moshe Reines. So he was in contact with this Reb Shlomo Zalman, and he gave him his life history and what he published, and he publishes it, listing out all the seforim in the sefer. And he says, for example, When he was a kid, they couldn't get him to take his medicine. What did they do? They bribed him with a new sefer. He was already at a young age collecting svarim. This library was considered mashundik because not only did it have a lot of svarim, it had a lot of manuscripts. And he was very helpful, and there's a long list of who he helped. Okay, fine. Now, so he's one such person, and we're going to get more about this person in a moment. So he's one such person, collector, publishing some works, and helping people further. But that's not enough. That's not enough.
You mentioned in the past your involvement with Moshe Reines. Remind us again, wasn't he the son of who died young?
Yeah, okay, so basically and because it's going to play out today also a little bit, is there was a Yid, Rav Moshe Reines. He was the son of Rav Reines, the famous Rav Reines, one of the big leaders in the Mizrahi world, but he was a Volozhiner, a friend of the Netziv, one of the Gedolim of Lita before the Mizrahi movement even was founded, and a prominent Rav, a tremendous Mechaber Svarim. So he had a son named Moshe Reines. Moshe Reines tragically died at 20. Anyway, it seems that he was a prolific writer. I came across some articles of his that he wrote, and it sparked my curiosity, my interest into looking into this Moshe Reines, and I reached out. I have connections with friends with family members of Rav Reines, to help sponsor it maybe a little bit. And we're going to put out a small little booklet of Rav Reines' material. I told him, just give me a few days. I want to do some research. If maybe Reines has some more material. I end up covering and finding out if this is the size of the work. It's over 700 pages. I covered dozens of articles written by this from the age of 14, 15. He was writing in all the top publications, excellent articles on a wide ranging of subjects. One of the things that he does is relating to what we're going to be talking about is he spoke about some of these important people, so to speak.
Is that safer you just showed available for purchase if somebody wants to be in touch with you?
Definitely. So I'm more than welcome to buy it. It's called Mivchar Ksavim Rav Moshe Reines. And so Lamashal, he has an essay where he would reach out to these people and while they were alive, and he gathered information. So one person that we're talking about is this Rav Shlomo Zalman. But the next person, it's not one person, it's not enough. There's another person. That person is Rabbi Avrohom Harkavy. Who's Rabbi Avrohom Harkavy? So he's born in 1835. He dies in 1919. Okay. Now, who is he? He's a Yid, comes from a Chashuva family. His father was in Yerushalayim even. A Chashuva, a Talmud Chacham. I believe he was also maybe even a Maggid Shir somewhere in Yerushalayim. Anyway, he learned we're in the great yeshiva of Alajim by who? By the Netziv. Okay. Now, to just show an interesting idea where he says straight up that he learned in Volozhin, there's a sefer, the first sefer that was ever written about Chaim Volozhin is called Toldos Rabbeinu Chaim Volozhin from a Chashuv Yid, Moshe Shmuel Shmukler. So this Rav Shmukler, he wrote a letter to Harkavy to get ha'arus about a sefer. Harkavy writes, I also was a Talmud from Yeshivas Eitz Chaim when I was young, and I was able to learn by the Netziv. He says straight out that he learned by the Netziv. Anyway, he learned in Volozhin. Eventually, he goes to university, and he remains from Erlich Yid his whole life, and he was connected with, and he kept up a kesher with all different people. He was in Russia, in Petersburg, and he had all types of connections, and he helped tremendously. He had a tremendous kesher with none other than the Netziv. Now, on two fronts, he had this connection. One is that he helped the Volozhin yeshiva a lot, and the Netziv would write to him to have him help, but he also was an expert in most importantly, Gaonim. He discovered major works of Gaonim. One such work that he published was a work called Chuvas HaGaonim, and it usually, we'll see in parentheses, it says Harkavy. L'mashal, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, in his list of his library, we find that the Sefer prominently is there, and he uses it all the time. He's in his Kiryat Melech and other places, Chuvas HaGaonim Harkavy. This is one of the most important, earliest works of an important collection of Gaonim collected, including Chuvas Arif. Harkavy wrote a beautiful introduction where he discusses the significance of this, of the cheshivas of this work. All different things are discussed in this interesting introduction, but it's very important in the world of Gaonim. And this Harkavy, not only did he publish one sefer, he published many svarim. He also was a yid that was very helpful. People would always write into him. He was very helpful, answering questions of all types. He had a tremendous yada in all areas relating to everything over here.
These two figures, Halberstam and Harkavy, where were they located?
So, what do you mean where? So I said,
We're in Europe. They
Harkavy
were
is active most of his time. He's in St. Petersburg. Halberstam, I forget where he was mostly based. I forget exactly where he was, but it's I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you
I'm sure the audience could send in those who are
I
familiar with
could check
Hasidic
easily in the
dynasties.
essay that Reines published. It says exactly where he was and everything, but I'm not.
Excellent, and here's connection, I'm sure, to the Halberstams
Right. Yes, he's
of
also
the
connected
Hasidic
somehow
dynasty.
to the Halberstam family. Yes, it says there also. Anyway, so Lamashal Reines in the same book, he also writes all about Harkavy and the Chashivas and all the public. He wrote hundreds of articles and all different things and manuscripts that he published. Okay, so he's not a yid in this long line of people that are instrumental in helping Rishainim and Ga'inim getting out there. Now he actually helps the Netziv. And the Netziv has these beautiful letters that have been published in the Sefer. There's a set of Svarim, returning to manuscripts for a second, called Shnai Star Vidar from the Desslers, the Desslers in Cleveland. And this is based on the collection that Dessler collected all the years. So he eventually publishes them in a beautiful volume, Shnai Star Vidar. It's already up to 6 volumes. So one volume, the first volume already, he has a bunch of letters of the Netziv and Harkavy back and forth, and there were letters in learning, and there's a whole episode could be given just to see the galus of the Netziv, different things that come out from these letters. Of course, these letters are published in later collections. They're also censored, because there's a Kaseder minig, I guess, to censor lots with the Netziv. But anyway, in the Dessler version, they're not censored. And you see the Netziv asking assistants to help Volozhin because the government was always constantly making problems for it, but also letters and learning and even relating to stuff in Gainim. He says, I'm reading your stuff, send me this, that, all different things. Due to lack of time, I'm not going to go into all different things. So these are two, but the point is, these are two people that they are involved with Rishainim. They're helping people. They themselves are publishing. They're publishing articles of manuscripts, and they are publishing whole works. Okay, but why am I picking these two people? Because of the continuation of the story. It's not enough to have an individual here, an individual here. Yes, Rome was not built in one day. We know that, but it's not enough to have individuals. You need to have something more. So obviously, there is different. Today, Lamashal, you go over to someone, you say, who publishes Rishainim from manuscripts? I'll tell you, there's a Mechon, Meister of Cook, there's a Mechon Yerushalayim, there's a Havat Shalom. They'll tell you all these things. But where did this all start? So one of the places that this started, interestingly enough, was a Mechon called Mekitzei Nirdamim. Basically, wake up and publish these stuff. So what happened? What's the story of this mechon? Of this, I guess we'll use the word mechon for lack of a better word right now. Anyway, in the 1860s, the idea came up earlier. A lot has been written about it, but not fully. In various booklets that came out by the Mekitzei Nirdamim have published with essays about it that were speeches given at different points in time about what they did, what their goals were, and the main goal was set out in the early 1860s was we have to make an organized group of people to publish the manuscripts that are out there that have not been published, Iker of Rishainim. How do they do it? They were going to create a whole thing, which was you paid membership, and if you gave X amount, you got to each book. I'm going to try to put out X amount of Svarim per year. They had chashuv people involved with it in all different aspects. And more interesting people were also involved. The interesting we'll use just the word maskilim, even though it's a broad term, but also other people were involved. Who signed up with it? All different people from all over Europe, including Gedolim. Let's say the Steichemed, we find him, Ramar Gimpel Yafi, Reb Chaim Berlin, the Netziv. These are all people that subscribe. They would pay membership, and then they would be guaranteed to get the publications of Mekitzei Nirdamim. Okay. Now, I'm just going to mention, just to understand what we're talking about, when it first began, so one of the first works they printed is a sefer called Malamed Hatalmidim from Yaakov Amtuli. So this work comes out in 1866. So when you open up the volume, you'll see that it says who's involved: Moses Montefiore, Shadal, interesting character, Avram HaKohen, Ramatisio Strashon, Eliezer Lippman Zilberman, and Eliezer Levi. Okay. This is one of the first books that they publish. Now, so you'll be getting very nervous. You see people, they might be questionable. But then all of a sudden you turn the next page. Who gives the haskama? The haskama is none other than the great Reb Shlomo Kluger. And Reb Shlomo Kluger says, this manuscript was brought to me. and I gave them this Mekitzei Nirdamim permission to print it. I said it's great. Now, so first we see is like this. Where did this come from? It comes from none other than the library of the great Rebbe Avrohom Berliner. He had this Ksav Yad. Says Reb Shlomo Kluger, he checks this Ksav Yad. He's saying it's authentic. How do we know it's authentic? Says Reb Shlomo Kluger in this letter, he compares it to other quotes where this Sefer HaMalamed is quoted by, let's say he says the Kolboy, the Menari Samar, and the Avraham, and they're here. So we know it's real. So there's no question of a forgery. So basically that Reb Shlomo Kluger is giving a thing, but he says, I went through the whole Sefer. And in the Hagdama, they mention more how he sat and went through it, and the son of Rebbe Avrohom Berliner gave it, they sold it to them, and then they publish it. They checked it with other manuscripts, and here is one of the first seforim that comes out from Mekitzei Nirdamim, is from the library of Avrohom Berliner, with the haskama of none other than a pretty kanoistic Galicianer Gadol, Reb Shlomo Kluger. So here you see Jews from all over working. You have together, and that's what it was. It was all over Europe. People from Galicia, people from Litva, people from Russia, from Paris, all trying to reach together to join forces. Now, what did they do? Back to those newspapers. They would advertise in the newspapers, sign up for Mekitzei Nirdamim. If you get it, you're going to get the sefer. Okay, and that's what they would do. And they ended up publishing not one sefer, but close to 150 manuscripts of Rishonim. And I'm not going to go through a complete list of everything, but the areas that they publish is literally, I would say, in all different areas, no jokes, are covered. Midrashei Chazal from manuscript, Chiburim relating to the Rambam, Rishonim, are all covered with over the years, and they still exist ad hayom. Every year or two, another work comes out. I'm just going to list just so you can understand what we're talking about. Igeris Rambam, an edition comes out. Archas Chaim from Aaron HaKohen Millennial comes out. Eshkol through them. Some volumes of the Meiri, Chiburim of the Radak. Materials of the Kohanim, such as the Sefer Hilchos Gedolos, Hilchos Psukos comes out from them. Other stuff from Harkavy, Sefer Hasidim, not the famous Sefer Hasidim that everyone has, is another one that has much more material, comes out through them. I'm not going to go through everything, just to mention there's a Medrash Beishus Rabasi, Medrash Hagadol starts through them, the Mavitus, the Sefer Ravya, Mechilta Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Machzer Vitri, all these Svarim and many more come out through this Mechon. And this is for sure one of the main addresses of a Mechon that starts in the 1860s. It still exists today. We're talking, what year are we in? Right now it's 2023. They still exist. There were some tkufas that they were slowed down, but they've been publishing stuff. Now, some of the stuff is not necessarily as for the Ilam the standard regular person, or even in the yeshiva world, but many of the svarim that they published through the years are used, and people don't realize it came from Mekitzei Nirdamim, these people. Now, there are other people that get involved with them. It's not just that we have Reb Shlomo Kluger endorsing their first book. We have Lamashal, this great Galician Gadol, Reb Yaakov Shor. So he prints a Sefer Itim with millions of Haaretz in Krakow, 1903. Talmud Muvik of Reb Shlomo the Shalom Eshiv. Who does he publish it? With the help and under Mekitzei Nirdamim. Again, where did it come from? The manuscripts from this Reb Halberstam's collection. He helped him also. Okay, now there's obviously a lot of people involved with this, and there's a lot of stories. There's hundreds of stories, actually, because all the Svarim have their own individual stories and the impact. We're not going to go into that. But just to mention, who else gets involved? So first, this Harkavy gets involved with it. He's a very important person. The 1880s, he's invited into the board to decide which farm, to work on it, to look at it, to check it over. Shlomo Zalman Halberstam. Then they bring in at one point Avrohom Berliner from the Berlin Seminary, also a tremendous person. He did tremendous work in so many different areas, putting out svarim, hundreds of articles. He gets involved. He helps move this mechon more to publishing more manuscripts. He puts out, just to mention, Rashi al Torah. What does it mean, Rashi al Torah? From dozens of kisvei yad, with showing, at a yom, we always work on, when you're learning a Rashi, what's the makar for Rashi? Is it a medrash? Is Rashi saying his own chiddush? So he was one of the first people that did incredible work on this based on manuscripts. And it's endless.
This wasn't planned, but you mentioned Rashi, the source of Rashi. You could tell me if I'm wrong. I haven't seen anyone do a better job today than this art scroll set over here. This is the pocket size. They do a phenomenal job sourcing the Rashi. Or what do you say?
So I definitely cannot disagree. But one of their I guess, starting points of people that did this is this Avrohom Berliner in his edition, and then there's a bunch of other people. Everyone goes on the next, and then when you have this, then yes, today we're able to do it. So yeah, they're able to get very far into understanding where the Makayos of Rashi, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, that's being done. But yeah, I'm definitely not going to tell you that what you're saying is off the beaten, whatever. I hear where you're coming from.
Let's hear from the audience. Which chumash out there
with
has
Rashi? We're focusing on Rashi specifically.
Now, which chumash out there has the best sources for Rashi?
Right, correct, yes. So he also works on the Targum, and okay. Now, and there's a long list. Again, if one wants to find an essay with a lot of information about him, in the same book that I published with Moshe Reines, it's over there. This is not a ploy to get you to buy the book. I'm just mentioning this. Okay, now, the last person I would like to mention in relating to all this with Mekitzei Nirdamim is a Yid Shlomo Buber. Shlomo Buber is born in 1827. He dies in 1907. We spoke a little bit about him because the whole story with Chaim Kanievsky. We'll get back to him probably eventually a little bit. But the point is, what does he do, this Buber? He's a rich businessman, Galicianer. And he publishes also Rishonim and Midrashei Chazal. He publishes many times, the list I'm going to give very, very briefly. Some of these things were the first time they're published is by him. Psikta the Rav Kahana, Lekach Toiv from Rav Tovia ben Elazar, Lekutami Medrash Avhrom, Medrash Tanchuma HaKadum ben Hayasham, Lekach Toiv, Shibali HaLeket, the Agur, Medrash Tilim, Medrash Mishlei, Medrash Shmuel, and many others, Agadah Bereshis, and other Rishonim, Agadah Bereshis, on Megillus, all different things he publishes. And it's incredible. In standard-based medrash today, Adayim, Mechon Zichron has been reprinting most of his midrashim. They're available. Beforehand, they were available. Vakshal used to publish them. They were originally, a lot of these volumes were published by none other than Mekitzei Nirdamim. Sometimes he funded them because he was publishing before Mekitzei Nirdamim came around. But again, we have a rich collector. He was a rich collector who was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, was mamish kavei itim to learn. He had ksharim with many different gedolim, and he's publishing this stuff. So when you have all these people, and there's many more, slowly, you see how Rome gets built. And that's why today, when you go into your library and you see, we have so many Rishonim and so many things, the way it worked, this is how it was. Through a bunch of different Yechidim, eventually some of them join up and they form different Mechons. Okay. So Ad Kan with the let's say Mechon Mekitzei Nirdamim, but is there any other people? So I'm not going to, I myself didn't even bother to figure out how many other mechons are there, or people, or groups of people. But there's one person that recently information came to light. I would like to share about that, and we'll conclude with getting this back to Reb Chaim Kanievsky right now. And that is like this. And that is the Gerrer Rebbe, Rebbe Avrohom Berliner Alter, son of the Sfas Emes, known as the Imrei Emes. Very famous Rebbe of Gerrer. And it's famous that he was a seforim collector. Interestingly enough, before he was Rebbe, I recently came across a small book that was written about him from Binyamin Mintz. The Rebbetzin used to sell her jewelry so he could fund his collection. Okay. Now, when you hear that a Rebbe has a collection, so you might think, based on different stories, okay, so he had a seforim collection. How many seforim could he have today, in those days? And the answer is that in recent years, this library, it's become a few years ago, a book came out. The story always begins with a book. And the story comes, it's called Oil Rain. Rishimas Kisvei Yad Baitzar Svarim Shal Avrohom Berliner Alter Admon Migur. Who put it out? Moshe Hillel, the youngest son of Rabbi Yaakov Hillel. This son of Rabbi Yaakov Hillel is in the past 5 years has become very famous, prolific, beyond belief, published many different Svarim. Incredible yeda this person has, and one of the books is he puts out a full-fledged fancy book, close to 600 pages, about the Gerrer Rebbe's Kisvei Yad that he had in his library. They were lost in the Holocaust, most of them. But what happened is the Gerrer Rebbe had a list, and it seems he was in the business of selling the antiques at a certain point in time. It seems maybe doubles, and whatever the story behind that is. But what comes out, he explores the collection and the collecting of the Gerrer Rebbe, how he built up this massive collection. Not a collection of a few hundred svarim, and he looked at them and he liked them. He knew them. He was a world expert on svarim. Svarim, manuscripts, rear svarim, and he had hundreds of manuscripts of Rishonim, manuscripts of Achronim, on all topics, Kabbalah, Dikduk, even Shaptaut svarim he had, that we threw that out there to add for Nachi's svarim chatter. People got upset. Should he write that about this in this book? But he threw it in anyway. The Gerrer Rebbe has seen this book, read it. both groups of Gerrer have gone through this book. But anyway, what's the chashivas of this book? A lot of things, which we're not going to devote 5 episodes to that right now, but we see from here that the Gerrer Rebbe was a tremendous Svarim collector. But he wasn't just a oyev Svarim. He liked to have Svarim. He learned them. He knew them. But he was consulted, and he would encourage people to publish. And he helped people that he found out were publishing Svarim. He gave them stuff from his collection to help them publish. He lists this all out. He talks about this in his book. He did incredible research about it. One of the things we've been discussing, the Meiri. The Gerrer Rebbe was obsessed with the Meiri. He sent someone to make a copy of the Ksavi out of the Meiri also, and he had it, and he lent it out. And some of the Meiris that came out, we've already mentioned briefly, came from this library of who? Of the Gerrer Rebbe. L'mashal, certain Rishonim we've discussed Birchas Zalman Halberstam and the Ramban, and one of the places the Ramban says, where did this come from? The Gerrer Rebbe sent this in. And in here we find about other Rishonim that who owned it? The Gerrer Rebbe Rishonim. Okay, so he had these Svarim, but what does that help our story? The answer is, it's not just enough that you have Mekitzei Nirdamim. It's not enough. There's plenty of Svarim that need to come out. It's not enough to have Meiser of Cook and Mechon Yerushalayim. Mirz Hashem, there should be many more. Gvirim should fund all the hundreds and thousands of manuscripts that we have. Sai Rishonim, Sai Achronim. Although a lot has been done, there's still a lot. We have a long way to go. But what happens over here is when you open up this book, you see that he also started a mechon called Doiveve Sifsei Yeshanim in 1905, which the goal was to publish Svarim. And they put out a Kol Kaira, similar to the way Mekitzei Nirdamim, which I didn't show at the time. Here, let me show a copy of how the Kol Kaira that they sent out, they would put it up as an advertisement. Here you can see how it looks. This is how the Kol Kaira looks, a full-page ad in the newspaper, and was published a bunch of times. So here we have in this book from Moshe Hillel a full-page ad, 2-page ad, where they write similar type of thing. We're going to publish a bunch of Svarim, Rishonim, Gainim, all different things, Achronim, on all different areas. They publish. We have something from Sadia Gain. We have a Taisus Rabbeinu Elchanan. We're going to publish the Ra'ah, the Rivash, HaChadasha, and more stuff. Similar, we have plans of doing other chiburim. Membership, the same idea as Mekitzei Nirdamim. They do publish a few things. Who's in charge of this? Who's helping this? The Gerrer Rebbe. This is before he becomes the Gerrer Rebbe. Anyway, so this is well documented by this Moshe Hillel. He talks all about this. A few pages he devotes to this whole story, and at the same time, interesting enough, as the Gerrer Rebbe is doing this, and others, there's also in Egypt there was a Yid who put out a book called Toiv Mitzrayim, Rafal Aaron Ben Akai, and he put out a bunch of Svarim, also very into Svarim, and he also there was also other manuscripts, and I think eventually they wanted to join forces with the Ger, but that's beyond the scope. But the point is, there was a bunch of different entities of people that were trying to now publish the manuscripts, setting up mechons. Eventually, this turns into, between me and you, this is what happens. It comes to Mechon Yerushalayim and Meiser of Cook and the Havat Shalom and other such companies. There are a bunch. Sometimes the company could only end up putting out one volume, but sometimes they end up publishing many volumes. Okay, so Ad Kan this. Now, how do we get to this? Is helping us get to the origins of how Svarim getting out there. But now let's go one more step and to get back to Chaim Kanievsky, and this is how we'll conclude. And that's a story like this. Up till now, I was focusing on strictly Rishonim on Shas and Rishonim on Halacha. But we know Torah is big. So we mentioned briefly, came up a few times, there's Midrashim, Midrashei Halacha, Midrashei Agadah. All this also, when does this happen? We're not going to sit and document the whole story of that. A few of the things will come up more later on in different episodes. But basically, this also happens at this point. Mekitzei Nirdamim is also involved with this. And Rishonim on Chumash also, many manuscripts are published for the first time in these tkufas. Again, who embraces all this? Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Just to give one example, there's a chibur called Brisa de Mazalos, and there's another chibur called Brisa de Shmuel. These are brises that deal with mazalos and people that are Isaac in these topics. Go through them. When was the first time this Brisa de Shmuel was published from manuscript? It wasn't published. It's mysterious where it comes from, but in 1861 is the first time it comes published. It's authentic by it seems from the experts of today, the experts in understanding Lashonis and stuff that they've discovered, and manuscripts. It's authentic, not a forgery of any sort. And basically, Reb Chaim Kanievsky goes ahead. The seforim are written being mefarish. One such yid was Reb Aryeh Leib Lipkin, a nephew and Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, a big expert in astronomy and zmanim, wrote stuff about it. Yeshua and devoted a bunch of pages to him in an earlier volume, and stuff of his came out from manuscript in recent years. He also wrote a beautiful Chibur on Shir Hashirim, and he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham and an expert in Kabbalah and all different things. Now, so he wrote a Chibur on this Brisa de Shmuel. Comes along, Meirenu Reb Chaim Kanievsky. He writes about this Brisa, the Brisa Mazalis. He also writes, these are new discoveries. He writes Perushim on some of them. And then, more than that, back to the Sefer which we began season 1, Kiryat Melech on the Rambam. He uses as a makar for the Rambam this Brisa de Shmuel. So he's using these materials where the dating is in the 1860s. So the Brisa Mazalis is printed by Reb Wertheimer. We're going to discuss a little bit more about that later on. Reb Chaim Kanievsky writes a parish about it. These are manuscripts of Midrashim. Okay. Now, but the story goes further. Many Midrashim come out, many seforim, and we will discuss about them, and we'll get to them soon enough. But to conclude is as follows. Reb Chaim Kanievsky goes even further. Not only does he write a parish on Midrashim, he also publishes himself a parish on Chumash al Torah. That story, I don't know the exact story. It seems that the Rav Klugman was very fascinated by seforim, especially seforim of Rishonim that related to gematrias and stuff like that. He somehow found out about that the Rokeach has such a chibur. He got a hold of copies from the library. He went to the stipler and he asked him, Eitzah, who do you think should work on the ha'aris? Turns out Reb Chaim Kanievsky writes the ha'aris, at least for Rokeach. Eventually it's reissued. There's a lot to discuss about it. He ends up helping him with other volumes that he publishes. This Rav Klugman, he publishes Rabbeinu Ephraim, which has become very famous for other reasons, and some other seforim. And Reb Chaim Kanievsky is one of the people that went through the Ksav Yad, helps publish it, writes hundreds of ha'aros on the Sefer, and throughout his seforim quotes the Rokeach. So here we see him doing what the Mekitzei Nirdamim does at a seif. He not only does he use it, he publishes a manuscript. Someone brought him the manuscript. He publishes it with the Aris. Okay, so it's not like the Archas Chaim that we spoke about in one of the early episodes, which is a Rishon, and he writes Aris about it. That was a chibur that existed for a few hundred years. Here is Klugman brings him the manuscript and he writes Aris. Okay, now just to mention one last Ara with this. This is to the scoop that we mentioned all the way in the beginning. This ties to this. There was interesting yid, and as everyone knows, always you grow up hearing Yerushalayim is full of interesting yidden. There was a yid, Reb Shmuel Hominer. My introduction to this Reb Shmuel Hominer was that he wrote supposed to be an excellent chibur on Pirish Amilas of davening called Eilas Tamid.
Perhaps his name is Reb Shmuel Hominer. Many people pronounce it that way. We can have the audience let us know. Eliezer loves when we correct.
Yes, exactly. I can't say that I'm pronouncing it correctly. Anyway, the point is, so there's this yid. And he writes the Sefer Eilas Tamid. Who got me the Sefer Eilas Tamid? I quoted in the episode of Chanukah, my special Rebbe from 5th grade, Rabbi Berlovsky, Yaakov Kappel Halevi Berlovsky in Yeshiva Chaim Berlin. He gave me the Sefer. So I always had a chibur to interesting about this person. Turns out he's very prolific. And a few years ago, I come across a Sefer they printed from. He was a big Oived Hashem, and he printed a whole bunch of chiburim, and they printed based on his notebooks, Rishimois from his notes and his ksavim, called Mi Pink Kasav Shel Eved HaMelech. He wrote a chibur called Eved HaMelech on the mitzvahs on the Chumash, and this is how it is. I open it up and I see an interesting passage, and that's what I'm going to share with you in a moment. Living in Eretz Yisrael, and I'm sure if people come to Eretz Yisrael or learn Teres Bacha, you imagine come across that on Chalamoid, Sukkot and Pesach, there's something known as Birchas Kohanim at the Kaisel, and thousands of people come. I was always curious, where in the world does this thing come from? Is it a real thing? Is it a fake thing? I mean, it's nice. Birchas Kohanim is an amazing thing. As my Rav is very fond of saying, it's one of the many reasons why one should make Aliyah. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, you get Mekayim Duchening every day in Eretz Yisrael when you get blessed by the Kohanim. Okay. So the question is, where did this happen? How did this minig happen? Is it an old minig? Okay. Anyway, I start reading this book from Reb Shmuel and about it from his notebook, and it starts describing how he had a tremendous chibah for different types of mitzvahs after, especially when they got back the Kaisel in the old city. One of the things was he wanted to do a massive Birchas Kohanim. Okay, that everyone should get, and it's a special mitzvah, and we're zeicha to do it. And he had an idea that they should go to the Kotel and they should do a massive Birchas Kohanim. And he went to someone else, another person, another Adam Gadol, and okay, it sounds like a good idea. But this Adam Gadol said to him, in order to get people to do it, you have to have a good makar. It's not going to work if you don't have a good makar, especially if you have an early makar, it will help. So today we know when you read signs up, people just make up makaris, or they'll take a makar from a sefer that no one ever heard of, and they'll make it up. And sometimes you even get a Photoshop thing of some school of something. But this year was Ernst the Yid. He wanted to have a good makar for it. Anyway, turns out at the same time they were working on the Rokeach, the manuscript. In Parshas Tetzaveh, they came across a passage that says like this: V'im hayu shin kayhanim oimdim bahar hazesim v'hayu oimrim birchas hakayanim hayu ba Mashiach. Mashiach would come if 300 kayhanim would be at Har Hazesim. He immediately lets them know about this piece in the manuscript. It's in Parshas Tetzaveh, page Kuf Nun Vav, and says, here we have it. The Rokeach says that if you do this, it's unbelievable. Mashiach's going to come. Okay, now so they said, Lamais, it's not practical to have it to do it out of Seif and Har Hazesim, problematic. Everything. Consult the Gedolim, and bottom line is, they started to do it at the Kotel. Now, they didn't first do it at Chalamoid. They did it one time and it was successful. It seems the first time they did it was on Yom Gimel of Kislev, Tafshin Lamed Aleph, and thousands of people came. They did it on Chanukah. They did it a few other times. This Shmuel writes all about it, how it's amazing. Basically, through this, we at one point, he has a few letters in this book about it. And eventually it switches to Chalamoid. Okay, now, so the point is that where it comes from is this Rokeach that Chaim Kanievsky is working on. Rav Klugman, when he found out about it, obviously was also very happy. In this Sefer Yovel that they put out, the Sefer Zikaron they put out for Rav Klugman, they say one of his things was he was very into these types of things. They actually print a picture of one of the Kol Kairos that went up in one of the early times to go do the duchening. So you see here usage of the manuscript to go. Now, it turns out there's not only the Rokeach, there's also other early Rishonim. We mentioned the Sefer Hasidim. There's a passage of the Sefer Hasidim that was published from manuscript from Mekitzei Nirdamim that also says it. There's other stories, other sources about this Har Hazesim. Not for now. That's a tangent, which we're not going. But bottom line is, to be Messiah in this episode, is that we see what happened. It was through individuals. Individuals reached to Machons through different interesting people. We'll use that word. Then we'll say that the Gerrer Rebbe is also involved with it. Svardim Gedolim also get involved with it. Till we get back to Chaim Kanievsky using these materials once again, and including not only using it, but actively writing a Pirish on such a Medrash coming out from this, and a Pirish al Torah writing the Ha'aris and working on transcribing it and leading to our concluding story, this cute story of the origins of Birchas Kohanim at the Kotel.
Beautiful. Fascinating. If there's any grandchildren, children, family members of the Klugmans who are listening, please feel free to be in touch with us to give us more of the details. I personally know some of them. And this is an amazing scoop on the Birchas Kohanim at the Kotel. Thank you very, very much. Once again, we're looking forward to episodes on Meseches Nazir, on Hataras Nedarim / Kol Nidre. And please be in touch. This is a great opportunity to sponsor this incredible work. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.